Well, let's get some reaction to what happened from Christo Grozev from the investigative journalism group Bellingcat. Bellingcat, good to see you on the programme. Thank you for your time today. Just to tell us first more about Vladlen Tatarsky. Who was he?
Well, I mean, he's been described at this moment primarily as a military blogger, but one has to remember that he's in fact a soldier. He's an officer in the Russian army. He did participate in the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, 2016. He was part of the so-called Lugansk Republic's separatist army, which was in fact controlled by the Russian army. So it was just a proxy of the Russian military. And in 2022, he was assigned to one of the local regiments, and he has been in charge of intelligence gathering, of plotting trajectories of drones. So in fact, he's a soldier who in the evening was also a blogger. So that is an important distinction to make, because this can have a relevance as to the legitimacy of this operation if it turned out to be an Ukrainian operation. He was known for some extremely radical statements, including disparaging the official Russian military forces and praising the private military army Wagner. One might say that he was one of the main recruiters for Wagner, because he has been extolling their successes in Ukraine. And he was also known for a very, very rogue, one might say, statement upon the day that President Putin announced the annexation of the Lugansk and Donetsk Republic. He was at the party that was hosted by President Putin, and he recorded the video after the party in the presence of Putin behind him, where he said, "We will kill, we will murder, we will rape, and we will plunder as needed to achieve a victory." So you might imagine that he could well be a target for many, many different constituencies.
A highly influential figure, more than 500,000 followers on Telegram, and one of the most influential and prominent military bloggers.
That is true. And he was providing semi-transparent updates from the front line, which were interesting to read, even if you totally disagree with this person's agenda. So he was very popular. He was sometimes pointing to the foibles and mistakes committed by the Russian army. At this point, nothing is certain. I mean, it could well be that this was a Ukrainian operation. It might also be a Russian operation of Russian security services as a false flag operation to sort of consolidate the pro-war sentiments in Russia. I would still bet on the fact that it is more likely to be a Ukrainian operation. He was a legitimate target. He was an officer and an intelligence officer and a propagandist at the same time.
Wouldn't the Ukrainians confine their operations to military sites rather than a cafe in Russia's second city?
Well, absolutely, but this is a war of little resemblance to what we've seen before. It's a hybrid war in addition to being a hot war. This cafe, whether or not it was owned by Prigozhin, the owner of Wagner, was a cafe that was used regularly as a sort of a gathering point for Russian cyber warriors that are in fact targeting Ukraine's infrastructure and other organizations that are linked to the Wagner organization. So whether or not this was a purely civilian location, one might argue with that.
Yeah, a number of different theories, no doubt, will emerge before we actually know what has happened. He will have, as you say, highly influential, so he'd have many supporters, but an easy target, perhaps?
Well, yes, an easy target, and one that could be turned into a martyr by Russia's domestic services. That's why I'm ambivalent. I'm not sure. I cannot say for certain that this is not a Russian false flag operation. We will find out more details. I mean, we know that Russia is not a transparent society, but at this point, I expect a lot of leaks and a lot of statements by Russian intelligence services that would allow us to assess whether they're being transparent or just providing us with smoke and mirrors.
Just to elaborate on that false flag attack, that is something Russia would do, but deflect the blame onto Ukraine. Is that right?
It is correct. I mean, there's been a history of the Russia's domestic services creating false flag attacks in order to sort of stimulate pro-war sentiment. A lot of talk has existed also among Russia experts that back in the early, at the turn of the century, there was a series of apartment bombings in Russia in Moscow that sort of triggered the pro-war sentiment against Chechnya at the time. A lot of experts believe that that was a self-inflicted terrorist act in order to create such a sentiment, and thus this might be one of these.
Now, if this was deliberately targeted attack, which it looks like, I mean, if this statue that we understand exploded, that he was presented with in this cafe, this would be the second assassination, would it not, on Russian soil, of a senior figure associated with the war in Ukraine?
Yes, it will be probably the second and probably the first sophisticated, well-performed operation, because the previous one, at least from the information that has been leaked, did not achieve its target. The target of the previous one was Alexander Dugin, one of the lead ideologists of the Russia imperial state doctrine, somebody who believes that Ukraine should not exist, whereas his daughter, who was using his car at the time, who was equally a propagandist, but not in any way as influential as her father, and as much as a legitimate target as her father would have been, was killed. This, however, today achieved apparently the intended target. It was a statue that was given to the target, and it exploded and killed only him, while 19 other people have been hospitalized, I understand.
How much can we attribute to the theory this could have been by the resistance movement in Russia, perhaps a soldier coming back from the war in Ukraine?
As much as one would hope that there is an active resistance within Russia that takes risks, I think a lot of the talk that we've seen about that are, in fact, Ukrainian operations that are presented as local resistance. So I'm afraid that there's no organized resistance that we have to speak about within Russia at this point.
But it's your firm belief, as we speak right now, that you believe it was down to Ukraine?
It was either Ukraine or a minority opinion in part of my brain is that it could have been a false flag FSB operation, but more likely it was Ukraine.
All right, well, thank you very much indeed for your time tonight. It's good to get your thoughts. We're looking at live pictures at the scene of this cafe in St Petersburg. It is Russia's second city. One person died. We know who that person was. The well-known Russian military blogger Vladlen Tatarsky died in this blast. Real name Maxim Fomin had more than 500,000 followers on Telegram, one of the most prominent of the influential military bloggers, provided an often critical running commentary on Russia's war in Ukraine, heavily pro-Putin. Another 16 people were injured in that blast. We will keep you up to date with developments